It was a dark and stormy night, and I was driving to the cemetery to visit my girlfriend's grave. It had been 6 months since she passed away, and I still couldn't believe she was gone. She was only 25, and her death had come as a shock to everyone who knew her. As I pulled up to the cemetery gates, I noticed that the usual security guard was nowhere to be seen. The gate was wide open, and there was no sign of anyone around. I felt a chill run down my spine as I drove through the gates and onto the winding path that led to the burial grounds. The rain was coming down in sheets now, making it hard to see anything outside of my car. The headlights barely penetrated the darkness, casting eerie shadows on the trees that lined the path. I felt like I was driving through a nightmare. Finally, I arrived at my girlfriend's grave. I got out of the car and walked over to the headstone. The rain was still pouring down, and I was completely soaked through, but I didn't care. I just wanted to be close to her, even if it was just her grave. As I stood there, I heard a faint whispering sound. At first I thought it was just the wind, but then the sound grew louder. It sounded like someone was whispering my name. I turned around, but there was no one there. Just the rows of graves stretching out before me. I felt a shiver run down my spine, and I started to feel like I wasn't alone. Suddenly, I saw a figure moving in the darkness. It was too far away to make out any details, but it was definitely there. I froze, unsure of what to do. Was someone else out here in the stormy night, or was it something else entirely? As I watched, the figure began to move closer. I could now make out the silhouette of a person, but something about it seemed off. It was almost as if it was gliding across the ground rather than walking. My heart was pounding in my chest as the figure got closer and closer. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or scream. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished into thin air. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what had just happened. Had I really seen a ghost, or was it just my imagination playing tricks on me? As I turned to leave, I heard the whispering again, only this time it was louder, and it was coming from right behind me. I spun around to face the whispering, but there was no one there. My heart was racing and my mind was filled with fear. Had my girlfriend's grave been disturbed? Was someone playing a cruel prank on me? But then I heard the whispering again, and this time it was clearer. "Help me," the voice said, and I recognized it immediately as my girlfriend's voice. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Maybe it wasn't a ghost after all. Maybe it was just my imagination. I called out her name, hoping for a response, but there was only silence. The whispering had stopped, and the cemetery was quiet once again. I decided to leave, feeling uneasy about what had just happened. As I got back into my car, I noticed that the rain had stopped. The sky was clearing up and the moon was beginning to peek through the clouds. I started the car and began to drive out of the cemetery. But then, out of nowhere, a thick fog rolled in, obscuring my vision. I slowed down, afraid that I might hit something, and then I saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the road, blocking my way. I slammed on the brakes, coming to a screeching halt just inches away from the figure. It was the same silhouette I had seen earlier, but this time it was much clearer. It was a woman dressed in white, with long dark hair that flowed down her back. She looked like she was straight out of a horror movie. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Was this really happening? Was I hallucinating? I felt like I was in a nightmare, unable to wake up. The woman in white began to move towards my car, her face expressionless. I was frozen in fear, unable to move or scream, and then, just like before, she vanished into thin air. I sat there for a few moments, trying to process what had just happened. I didn't know what to do or where to go. All I knew was that I had to get out of the cemetery and fast. I started the car and stepped on the gas, driving as fast as I could, but the fog was so thick that I could barely see where I was going. And then I heard it, a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the cemetery. The scream was so loud and terrifying that I slammed on the brakes, almost causing myself to crash. I was too afraid to move, too afraid to even look around me. The fog was thick, and the cemetery was completely silent once again. After a few moments of silence, I started the car and began to drive again. I just wanted to get out of there and go home. But the further I drove, the stranger things became. I started to hear strange noises coming from the back seat of my car, as if someone was sitting there. I looked in the rearview mirror, but there was no one there. The noises continued, growing louder and more intense with each passing moment. And then, suddenly, the car radio turned on by itself. It was playing a song that my girlfriend and I used to listen to together. I felt a wave of nostalgia wash over me, but it was quickly replaced by fear. How was this happening? The radio station started to change on its own, cycling through different channels until it stopped on static. And then I heard a voice. It was a woman's voice, and it sounded like it was coming from the static. "Help me," the voice said, and it was the same voice I had heard earlier in the cemetery. I was completely freaked out now, but I couldn't stop the car. I had to get out of there. As I continued to drive, the car started to shake and vibrate. It felt like something was trying to break through the car's windows, and then, out of nowhere, the car stopped. I tried to start it again, but the engine wouldn't turn over. I was completely stranded, alone in the dark, with whatever was haunting me. Suddenly, I saw a figure in the distance. It was the woman in white, and she was getting closer. I tried to start the car again, but it was no use. I was trapped with no way out. As the woman got closer, I saw that her face was twisted in a gruesome expression of pain and agony. Her eyes were hollow, and her skin was pale as death. I knew then that this was no ordinary woman. This was a ghost, and she was after me. I sat there frozen, staring at the ghostly figure as she approached my car. I was completely trapped, with no way out. The woman in white was getting closer, and I could feel her icy breath on my face. I tried to start the car again, but the engine wouldn't turn over. It was as if the car had been completely drained of power. I was completely helpless, and the woman in white was almost upon me. She reached out with her ghostly hand, and I could feel her cold touch on my skin. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I was completely paralyzed with fear. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, the woman in white vanished. The car engine started up, and I was able to drive away. I didn't know what had just happened, but I knew that I needed to get out of there. I drove back to my apartment, completely shaken and terrified. As I pulled into the parking lot, I saw that the woman in white was standing outside my apartment building. I couldn't believe it. How was this possible? I got out of the car and walked towards her, trying to get a better look. But as I got closer, she vanished once again, leaving me standing there alone in the dark. I ran into my apartment, locking the door behind me. I was completely shaken, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every sound made me jump, and I couldn't sleep. The next day, I went to visit my girlfriend's grave once again, hoping to find some answers. But as I walked through the cemetery, I could feel the ghostly presence all around me. I knew then that I was in way over my head and that something had to be done before it was too late. I knew that I couldn't just ignore what had happened the night before. I had to find some answers, and the only way to do that was to face my fears and confront the ghostly presence head on. I did some research and found a local paranormal investigator who was willing to help me. He listened to my story and agreed to meet me at the cemetery that night. As we walked through the cemetery, I could feel the ghostly presence all around us. The investigator had brought some equipment with him, and we started to pick up strange readings on his EMF meter. We continued to walk through the cemetery, following the readings on the meter. And then, suddenly, we saw her. The woman in white was standing in front of us, her ghostly presence almost overwhelming. The investigator started to ask her questions, trying to get some answers, but the ghostly figure remained silent, staring at us with her empty eyes. Suddenly, the investigator's equipment started to malfunction. The EMF meter was going crazy, and his digital camera was taking pictures on its own. We knew then that this was no ordinary ghost. As we tried to leave the cemetery, the woman in white started to follow us. We could hear her footsteps, but when we turned around, there was no one there. We eventually made it out of the cemetery, but we knew that this was far from over. The ghostly presence was still with us, and we needed to find a way to get rid of it. The investigator recommended that we try a spiritual cleansing, and we agreed to give it a try. We found a local priest who was willing to perform the cleansing, and we set a date for the following week. I knew that this was my last chance to get rid of the ghostly presence that had been haunting me. I just hoped that the cleansing would be enough to banish the spirit for good. The day of the spiritual cleansing had finally arrived. I was nervous but also hopeful that this would finally put an end to the ghostly presence that had been haunting me. The priest arrived at the cemetery, along with the paranormal investigator and a small group of witnesses. We all stood in a circle, holding hands as the priest began the cleansing ritual. He recited prayers and used holy water to bless the area. The ghostly presence was becoming more and more agitated, and I could feel her getting closer. Suddenly, the woman in white appeared in front of us. Her ghostly form was more vivid than ever, and she let out a blood-curdling scream. The priest continued with the cleansing, undeterred by the ghostly presence. He was determined to banish the spirit once and for all. And then, suddenly, the ghostly figure vanished. The air was still, and the silence was almost deafening. It was as if the ghostly presence had finally been banished for good. We all breathed a sigh of relief, knowing that the cleansing had been successful. I felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders, and I knew that I could finally move on from the terrifying encounter. As we all left the cemetery, I felt grateful to the priest and the paranormal investigator who had helped me through this ordeal. I knew that I would never forget what had happened, but I also knew that I could finally put it behind me and move forward with my life. As I left the cemetery, my mind was flooded with memories of my girlfriend. I thought about the times we had spent together, the moments we had shared, and the love we had felt for each other. I realized that, in a way, the ghostly presence had brought me back to the cemetery to confront my feelings about her death. I had been avoiding the pain and grief for too long, and now I knew that it was time to face them head on. I decided to visit my girlfriend's grave, to pay my respects, and to say goodbye properly. As I stood there, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. I knew that she was gone, but I also knew that she would always be with me in my heart and in my memories. I sat there for a while, just thinking about her and the life we had shared. I felt like I had finally found closure, and I knew that it was time to move on. As I left the cemetery, I felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I knew that the ghostly presence had been a reminder of the love I had lost, but it had also given me the strength to face my grief and to find closure. I walked away from the cemetery, feeling grateful for the time I had spent there. I knew that I would never forget the terror I had felt, but I also knew that I could finally let go of the pain and move on with my life. Months had passed since the spiritual cleansing at the cemetery, and I had finally moved on from the ghostly encounter. I had learned to live without fear, and I had found new ways to honor my girlfriend's memory. I had started volunteering at a local charity in her name, and I had even met someone new who had helped me to open my heart again. Life was good, and I knew that my girlfriend would be proud of the progress I had made. But one night, as I was lying in bed, I felt a chill run down my spine. I sat up, and there she was. The woman in white was standing at the foot of my bed, just as vivid as ever. But this time, instead of feeling fear, I felt a sense of peace. I knew that she was there to say goodbye, to let me know that she had moved on and that it was time for me to do the same. And just like that, she was gone. I lay back down in bed, feeling a sense of closure that I had never felt before. I knew that it was time to let go of the past and to move forward with my life. The next day, I went back to the cemetery one last time. I stood there looking at my girlfriend's grave, and I said my final goodbye. I knew that she would always be with me in my heart, but it was time to let her go and to start a new chapter in my life. As I walked away from the cemetery, I felt a sense of peace and closure that I had never felt before. I knew that the ghostly encounter had been a reminder of the love I had lost, but it had also given me the strength to face my grief and to find closure. I walked away, feeling grateful for the time I had spent there and looking forward to the future. Life was good, and I knew that my girlfriend would always be with me in spirit. But it was time to move on and to start a new chapter in my life.